The most powerful army of the ancient world marched in perfect formation and deliberately left behind one of the deadliest weapons known to humanity. Persians, Parthians, and Macedonians built entire military systems around archers capable of blackening the sky with volleys. Rome went the opposite direction. Iron, shields, the will to meet the enemy's gaze at arm's length. Why did the Romans refuse to place archers at the center of their warfare? The answer cuts deeper than tactics. It reveals a philosophy of combat built on honor, discipline, and absolute mastery of the space between two men. How the Roman army functioned from the inside out, why infantry dominated everything else. And what does that choice expose about one of the most remarkable military civilizations ever to exist? To grasp why Roman archers never occupied the heart of the legions, you have to enter the mentality of a civilization that viewed war in a fundamentally different way from its contemporary. In Rome, combat was not merely a question of efficiency. It was first a question of virtus. The Latin word virtus is often rendered as virtue. Its original meaning was far more specific and far more violent. Virtus derived from vir, meaning man. It described the essence of what it meant to be a true Roman: physical courage, resistance to suffering. Above all, the capacity to face an enemy at a few centimeters distance and prevail in hand-to-hand combat. War, for a Roman, was the highest expression of this quality. It had to be lived up close, felt on the skin, in the sweat, in the weight of the shield grinding against the left arm while the gladius met resistance on the right. For the Roman mind, authentic combat was direct contact between two warriors, the collision of shields, the collective shove of formations, metal striking metal at less than a meter's distance. This was war as Rome understood it. The historian Polybius, who observed the legions firsthand in the 2nd century before Christ, recorded his admiration for the willingness of Roman soldiers to advance directly against the enemy without hesitation, regardless of what awaited them. In his work, Histories, he described the Roman legion and the Macedonian phalanx not merely as two tactical formations, but as two entirely distinct philosophies of war. The phalanx depended on the reach of the sarissas. The legion depended on human determination to close the distance. The confrontation between these two systems reveals more than it appears. The Macedonian phalanx, with sarissas exceeding 6 meters, created a wall of iron points the enemy had to cross before reaching the soldiers. It was a philosophy of war that treated distance as an advantage. The Roman legion, by contrast, used the Pilum, the throwing spear, to disorganize the enemy, then advanced with the gladius into the closest possible combat space. The legion wanted proximity. In that proximity, it became devastating. This philosophy had deep roots in Roman social structure: the religious rituals before battles, the arming ceremonies, the tradition by which the finest soldiers received decorations such as the corona civica, the civic crown, granted to those who saved a Roman comrade's life through personal bravery in combat. All of it constantly reinforced one idea: war was a test of character conducted in the space of a few meters between two men. Decimus Mus, the Roman consul who offered himself in ritual sacrifice during the Battle of Lake Vadimon in 310 BC, hurling his own body against the enemy to inspire his troops, was celebrated as a hero for entire generations. That extreme gesture of physical approach to danger represented, for the Romans, the purest ideal of warrior virtue. The general and writer Vegetius, author of the treatise Epitoma Rei Militaris, composed at the end of the 4th century of the Common Era, documented in detail how Roman training constantly emphasized close combat. He described exercises with wooden posts where recruits learned to push, strike, and wield the shield not as passive protection, but as an offensive weapon designed to create openings in the enemy's body. For Vegetius, the ideal Roman soldier was one who dominated the immediate space around his own body, not the space at 50 meters. When Rome looked at archers in antiquity, it saw the precise inversion of that ideal. The archer killed from a distance. He never needed to meet the enemy's gaze, never felt the jarring shock of shield against shield, never endured the suffocating compression of close-quarters combat. He never required what Romans called animus, that warrior spirit forged exclusively in direct confrontation. Killing at range was technically effective. Morally, it was hollow. The difference between a lion that hunts and a snare that catches. Both produced results. Only one carried glory. The historian Titus Livy recorded multiple instances where Roman soldiers voiced open contempt for enemies who fought at a distance. During the Samnite Wars, legionaries taunted opponents armed with slings and bows, daring them to close the gap and fight face to face. This was not personal eccentricity. It was the expression of a worldview saturating Rome's entire military culture. And critically, this disdain for ranged combat was not simply irrational. For the type of warfare Rome waged most often, systematic territorial conquest, siege operations, absorption of subject peoples, heavy infantry in tight formation genuinely outperformed archers. The problem surfaced when Rome met enemies who refused to fight on those terms. But that comes later. To understand why archers never occupied the legion's core, you need to understand how the Roman army functioned from the inside. A war machine of near-perfect human engineering that solved the problem of range without a dedicated archer corps. The classical Republican legion organized itself into 3 combat lines: Hastati at the front, Principes in the center, Triarii at the rear. Velites, light infantry, operated along the formation's margins. Each line served a precise function in this bloody choreography. The Hastati were young soldiers who absorbed the initial shock and tested enemy resistance. The Principes were seasoned veterans who finished the opponent once exhaustion had set in. The Triarii were the oldest, the most experienced, a last resort reserve armed with long spears, committed only when the situation turned genuinely desperate. A Roman saying captured the gravity of that moment perfectly. Res ad triarios reddit. The matter has reached the Triarii. It was an expression of absolute crisis. What most analyses of the legion overlook is that it was never devoid of ranged capability. It simply refused to rely on the bow as a primary instrument. The legion had developed its own ingenious solution to projecting force at distance: the Pilum, a heavy throwing spear that was arguably the most intelligently designed weapon of the ancient world. The Pilum was a masterpiece of military engineering. Roughly 2 meters in total length, it combined a wooden shaft with an iron shank extending about 60 centimeters. The brilliant detail lay in the junction between metal and wood. It was deliberately weak. When the pilum struck an enemy's shield, the wooden shaft bent or snapped, rendering the weapon useless to the opponent. Simultaneously, the dead weight of that bent shaft lodged in the shield made the enemy's defensive equipment nearly impossible to manage. The opposing soldier faced a choice: abandon his shield or fight burdened by extra weight at precisely the moment the legions launched their sword charge. The sequence was calculated with surgical precision: disarm, destabilize, destroy. Each legionary typically carried 2 pila, one heavier for close-range throwing, one lighter for greater distance. The coordinated volley of pila by hundreds or thousands of soldiers, followed immediately by the charge with the gladius, produced a 2-phase sequence of destruction that proved devastating against virtually any opponent. Polybius described with visible admiration the psychological and physical effect of this combined tactic in battles against Macedonians and Gauls. The sky went black with pila. Enemy shields became dead weight. Then the legions closed in. Beyond the pilum, Roman legions deployed field artillery at scale, the ballista and the onager. The ballista functioned as a torsion catapult, hurling stone projectiles or iron-tipped bolts with remarkable force and accuracy. The onager, named for the wild donkey, a nod to the brutal recoil the machine produced at the instant of release, launched heavy stones along high arcs, perfect for smashing compact formations or fortification walls. These machines were crewed by specialists designated artifices, embedded directly within the legion's logistical framework. During a typical Roman siege, dozens of these weapons fired in coordination. They generated systematic kill zones that defenders could not afford to ignore. The legion also developed early a doctrine for integrating ranged assets with infantry movement. In pitched battle, machines occupied the flanks. They carved fire corridors that funneled the enemy exactly where the legionaries wanted them. In siege operations, Roman ballistic capability was feared across the entire Mediterranean basin. Julius Caesar recorded in the Gallic War the sheer terror his machines inflicted on Celtic warriors who had never encountered such concentrated, disciplined firepower. When Caesar's artillery discharged in unison, the general himself reports, even the bravest warriors hesitated before advancing. All of this points to a coherent Roman philosophy on range. Use it to prepare the ground. Create favorable conditions for close combat. Never treat it as the objective itself. The volley of Pila and the fire of ballistae existed so the Roman sword could perform its definitive work. For the Roman mind, this was the correct sequence. An architecture of violence with a clear beginning, middle, and end. First, destroy the enemy's shield, then destroy the enemy. One more factor made archers relatively dispensable across most Roman campaigns. The nature of the opponents Rome faced most frequently: Celtic tribes of Gaul, peoples of the Iberian Peninsula, Hellenistic kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean. Most of these enemies fought within the same close combat paradigm as the Romans themselves. They fielded cavalry, infantry, occasionally slingers, some auxiliary archery. But the decisive engagement was always the infantry clash. Rome was extraordinarily well prepared for precisely this type of confrontation. To grasp why the Romans preferred infantry so absolutely, you need to understand the process that transformed a young Roman into a legionary. A process so intense and formative that it produced not merely a soldier, but a deep identity defining who that man was in the world. Training of Roman soldiers was, by the standards of antiquity, extraordinarily systematic and scientific. Thucydides described the phases of this transformation in meticulous detail. What emerges from his account is a program combining brutal physical conditioning with precise technical instruction, and above all, constant ideological indoctrination shaping how the soldier perceived himself in combat. The first element was marching. A Roman legionary had to cover 30 Roman miles, roughly 24 modern kilometers, in 5 hours. He carried all his own equipment. This meant the complete armament: the gladius, the double pilum, the heavy rectangular scutum, the bronze helmet, the iron mailcoat known as lorica hamata, or in later periods, the lorica segmentata of articulated metal plates. Plus field equipment, wooden stakes, a shovel, 3 days' rations, cooking utensils. Total weight could easily exceed 25 or 30 kilograms. In popular Roman slang, the soldier burdened with all this was called a mule of Marius, a reference to the general Gaius Marius, who reformed the army in the 1st century before Christ and made every legionary responsible for hauling his own gear, eliminating dependence on slow, vulnerable baggage trains. The second element was weapon handling. Recruits initially trained with wicker shields and wooden swords, both deliberately manufactured at double the weight of real equipment. This pedagogical method meant that when real weapons finally appeared, the soldier experienced immediate relief and a surge of capability. A body conditioned to move a 10-kilogram shield found the actual 5-kilogram version almost weightless. Gladius training emphasized the thrust over the cut, a choice reflecting Roman combat philosophy at its core. In tight formation, wide slashes had no room. A precise thrust under the enemy's shield or between his ribs always did. Thucydides stated this without ambiguity. A stab penetrating 2 or 3 fingers deep is lethal enough. Cutting has no place in close formation. The third element, arguably the most critical for understanding the archer question, was collective formation drill. The Roman soldier trained relentlessly to function as part of a single organism. Hold position regardless of chaos. Trust the men on either flank absolutely. Feel the rhythm and pressure of the formation as one body breathing and advancing together. This drill forged a profound interdependence that was simultaneously the legion's greatest asset and its most defining trait. An archer by nature operated in a fundamentally more individual mode. He required space to maneuver, visibility to aim, freedom to seek advantageous ground. All of this was structurally incompatible with the close order formation that constituted the legion's soul. Integrating archers into legionary structure was not merely a technical difficulty, it was a philosophical contradiction. The legionary trained to feel his comrade's shoulder pressed against his own. The archer trained to separate, to create distance. A significant social dimension compounded this divide. The status of the Roman legionary in society was substantial, particularly after the reforms of Gaius Marius. When military service opened even to the proletarians, the army became one of the primary vehicles for social ascent and full citizenship. The legionary was a respected professional, a citizen under arms, the physical embodiment of Roman power. Veterans received land, pensions, tangible social prestige. Generals like Caesar distributed gifts and honors personally to soldiers who distinguished themselves in combat. And distinction in combat always meant something that happened at close range. The archer, by contrast, was generally recruited from foreign peoples and occupied a far lower rung in the Roman military hierarchy. Archers served almost exclusively as auxiliary troops, the auxilia drawn from provinces like Syria, Crete, Numidia, and Anatolia. They were accepted as a complement to Roman combat power. They were never integrated into the identity core of the legion. A Roman-born soldier who became an archer would have drawn a mixture of bewilderment and quiet contempt from his legionary comrades. There is an aspect of Roman training rarely discussed, but fundamental to understanding the legion, its weapons, and its tactics. Roman training produced generals, not only soldiers. The officers of the legions, centurions, tribunes, legates, all formed within the same philosophy of close combat. When these men planned battles, when they developed tactics and strategies, they did so from the perspective of someone who had spent years learning that proximity equaled power. Their tactical intuition, forged through training and combat, naturally generated solutions maximizing heavy infantry efficiency. For an experienced Roman centurion, the question was never, how can I kill the enemy from a distance? It was, how can I close with the enemy as fast as possible? The relationship between Rome and archers in antiquity ran far deeper than simple tactical preference. It involved dense layers of cultural prejudice, geographical association, and identity narratives that transformed the question of Romans versus archers into something almost ideological. Not merely a matter of military efficiency, but of how Rome perceived itself in the world and how it wished to be perceived. The bow in the ancient world carried strong associations with the East. The great archer empires, Persia, Parthia, Assyria, and then the steppe kingdoms were all Eastern, or they were associated with peoples living at the edges of the Mediterranean world. Peoples the Romans considered less civilized, the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Huns, who would arrive later. All were feared specifically for their mounted bowmen. This geographical and cultural linkage carried weight. For a Roman, excessive reliance on the bow carried something barbaric in it. Even among the Greeks, a culture Rome admired profoundly, one from which it had absorbed vast portions of its intellectual and artistic identity, the bow sat in an ambiguous place. Ulysses, the cleverest of the Homeric heroes, was a renowned archer. But Achilles, the most glorious of all, never touched the bow. And the death of Achilles, the supreme warrior, came from an arrow loosed by the cowardly Paris. The man who had ignited the war not through courage but through seduction and theft. The Greeks coded this death deliberately. The most glorious fighter killed by the vilest weapon, at the hands of the least glorious man. Rome absorbed this narrative whole. The poet Virgil, composing the Aeneid, the national epic tracing Rome's mythical origins, depicted Aeneas and his warriors as men of sword and shield. When Virgil needed to render a hero at his most radiant, he placed a spear or blade in his hand, never the bow. Apollo himself, god of the bow in both Greek and Roman tradition, was celebrated in Rome far more for his prophetic, artistic, and healing capacities than for his marksmanship. An implicit hierarchy ran through Roman values. Direct physical courage ranked above any form of killing at a distance. Cicero, the great orator and philosopher of the 1st century before Christ, expressed across various writings, a view shared broadly among Roman intellectuals. Authentic warfare meant direct physical confrontation. Cicero was no soldier. He never composed a systematic military treatise. Yet his scattered remarks on martial matters reveal a consistent framework, one that equated close combat with Roman virtue and ranged fighting with foreign cunning. Not necessarily dishonorable, but certainly distinct from the highest expression of Roman valor. Beyond ideology, there was a concrete strategic dimension to Roman skepticism toward archers. Bowmen performed well under specific conditions: open terrain with clear sightlines, enemies lacking adequate protection, situations where distance could be maintained indefinitely. But in the wars Rome actually fought, conquest across European territory, siege operations, pitched engagements where two armies marched directly at each other, those conditions rarely existed in pure or sustained form. Once the gap between formations closed to less than 50 meters, something that happened in seconds when both sides advanced actively, the bow lost much of its effectiveness. An archer needed time to aim, space to maneuver, distance to remain lethal. The Roman legion, with its methodical and relentless forward pressure, stripped enemy bowmen of all three systematically. Then there was Roman defensive equipment. The scutum, the large rectangular shield of layered wood reinforced with a central metal boss, ranked among the most effective anti-arrow defenses in the ancient world. Its dimensions, its curvature that deflected incoming shafts laterally, its materials, all combined to make it remarkably resistant to archery fire. In testudo formation, the tortoise, where soldiers locked overlapping shields on every side and overhead, the legion could advance through sustained arrow volleys with relatively moderate casualties. Caesar recorded the masterful deployment of the testudo during the siege of Avaricum in Gaul. Legionaries pushed forward under intense enemy fire, shielded by the formation, and completed their objective with an efficiency Caesar himself described with visible admiration. This capacity to weather enemy archery reasonably well made the question of fielding their own bowmen even less pressing for Roman military planners. If Roman soldiers could cross a kill zone with acceptable casualties, and if their own throwing weapons, the pilum and the ballista, proved sufficient to break enemy cohesion before the final collision, why pour resources into a fighter class demanding years of specialized training, separate equipment, and an entirely different combat philosophy? The answer Rome settled on for centuries was simple. No sufficient reason existed. And for centuries, that answer worked. It took a catastrophe to force a reassessment. The history of Rome and its archers is not one of total absence. It is a story of marginal presence, and of a lesson paid for with roughly 20,000 Roman lives on a single sun-drenched afternoon in 53 before Christ. A defeat so shattering, it altered how Rome conceived of its enemies and of itself. Rome was never entirely blind to the bow's utility. From the Republic's earliest days, the army acknowledged specific circumstances where long-range projectiles became indispensable: sieges against high-walled cities, defense of fixed positions on elevated ground, operations in terrain where tight formation was impractical. For these situations, Rome turned to auxiliary troops, the auxilia, drawn from allied and subjugated peoples across the Mediterranean world. Cretan archers stood far above the rest in reputation. The island of Crete possessed an archery tradition stretching back millennia. Cretans had been celebrated for their skill with the bow since Mycenaean times. Rome recruited them regularly for specific campaigns, especially operations in the east, where terrain and enemy type made the bow more relevant. The historian Appian recorded the deployment of Cretan archers during the Mithridatic Wars at the opening of the 1st century before Christ. Their presence was deemed essential in certain siege operations across the mountains of Anatolia. The Syrians formed another frequently recruited group. The Roman province of Syria, with its diverse population and long history of contact with Eastern archer peoples, produced excellent